Welcome, I'm Dan100, and today I want to talk about Gears of War 4. Before I get started, I want to let you guys know this isn't a rant, this isn't meant to be hateful, this is meant to be my critique of the story and the campaign, characters, and the general plot. Before we begin, I want to let you know that there will be heavy spoilers for Gears of War 4, so do not listen to this unless you've beaten the game already. The issues I have here are with the story of the game. And don't get me wrong, the gameplay and everything in the game has been refined, cleaned up, and perfected. And to let you guys know, I'm actually a huge fan of Gears of War. I've played all the previous games, and I've even read all 24 issues of the Gears of War comic, and unlike a lot of people, I actually do enjoy the game's story. One of the main problems with the game is just that the story isn't very good. The three main characters, JD, Del, Kate, they really have no personality. The main plot of the game involves the three main characters having to track down Reyna, the leader of the Outsiders, after her and her entire village has been kidnapped by the Swarm. Unfortunately, we don't get to see any real character development for Reyna, Oscar, or any of the Outsiders, as they are all kidnapped just hours into the game. And the first couple acts is just a boring slog against the DBs, which are the new enemy faction made entirely of robots. From a design standpoint, I understand why the first two acts are so slow and meandering. It allows players to get used to the game, understand the game mechanics, and even learn a few new weapons, and for a slow and steady stream of exposition to be dumped onto the player. In these sequences, it kind of forces you to pick up the DB weapons, the Enforcer, M-Bar, Overkill, and Tri-Shot. But at the same time, it's just not very fun. DBs are a very boring faction to fight against. Common tactics for the DBs involve walking slowly at you, and that's about it. Most DBs just simply walk at you. They have very little tricks up their sleeve. I was actually very surprised playing Horde mode just recently. I noticed the DR1 protector can actually slide to the left or right when aiming a weapon at it. That is something I never encountered in the main campaign. The tracker DB seems a little counterintuitive to me. I understand its purpose is to fulfill the role of the ticker, but to me it seems to make no sense that the cog would make a robot that would roll up to somebody and then explode. It would make more sense to me if the tracker worked like a living taser, where it would roll up to a target and then simply begin to shock them or create an area of effect. It would still function as a ticker would. You can kick it away and shoot it in air, or at least it would make more sense. It would be more grounded in the reality. The Sentinel and Guardian, on the other hand, are both probably the most interesting of DBs, as they fly and have heavy weapons. Their land-based counterparts aren't anything too spectacular. At the start of Act 2, they then meet up with Marcus Phoenix, JD's dad, and from there it's just more DBs until about halfway in the game we get to our actual enemy, the new enemy, who's actually the old enemy. To get into the Swarm, I kind of like their design. They have more of a crustacean or insect vibe going with them, whereas the Locust, they were more reptilian, and I definitely like their gameplay. The way they play, the way you play against them, the fact that they can do everything you can do, these Swarm drones are actually one of the most interesting enemies. They can do the new yank and shank, they can mantle kick, they can tag you with grenades. I think that's fantastic. The Swarm drone is probably one of the better enemies in the game. The only downside of the Swarm drone is that they lack anything that really makes them identifiable. It's almost impossible to tell a Swarm drone torque bow user to a Swarm drone, whereas with the Locust, you always knew Theron guards and have a torque bow, you knew who the sniper was. The Locusts are much easier to identify when compared to their Swarm drone counterparts. I really like the Juvie. I like the way they interact with you, the way they run around, jump, climb all over cover. It just feels really interesting to see them run around the map, run around the levels, and see them climb and try to get to you. To a lesser degree, I like the Snatcher. I'm not a big fan of the Carrier though. Very basic of a video game enemy, just a big lumbering brute, which is a very common video game archetype. I'm just kind of bored with the idea of you walk into a room and here comes the boss, and then you walk into another room 10 minutes later and then that boss is just there again. But I think from a gameplay perspective, the Pouncer is very interesting. There's a little bit of teamwork and coordination involved in taking on the Pouncer. But aside from that, the game kind of ends. It just ends with no real conclusion. We get to a part of the game where in most games would be the midway point. It kind of feels like Gears of War kind of started off weak and ended weak. The twist at the end with Kate being related to Queen Mira is not only implausible and unlikely, but I feel like it was kind of a false... It just didn't feel earned in any way. It just felt like this was a Shyamalan twist of, and that's a thing, so that way you can be kind of impressed and shocked. I don't really see a lot of people being blown away by this, except for the very gullible. Yeah, it surprised me. The same effect would have taken place if you would have said Kate is actually a robot. It's the same effect of that reveal. Like, I don't know what they were thinking with that. It just seems completely out of left field. And one thing I would have to say is I really don't like the last level. I feel like a lot of video games get the final level wrong, and I feel that Gears of War definitely got this wrong. For one, you start off in giant robots, and then you happen to fight a giant monster boss. There's no real build-up to it. It's just, good thing we had these giant robots. If there was some sort of tension, some build-up, the characters knew that they were going to be going up against a giant monster, then we could kind of build up to it and have our characters get in these robots, some build-up. Instead, it just, hey, it's a great coincidence that we were in these giant robots. And you might say, Danny, you kind of skipped over the prologue. And there's a couple reasons for that. When I first played the game, I thought the prologue was really good, because I'm a big Gears of War fan, right? I like the story, I like the Astro Fields, I like the Pendulum Wars, I like E-Day, I like all that stuff. So going back and playing through some of those brief missions in Gears of War history, really, it gave me a little bit of like a nostalgia wave. But the issue here is that the prologue has absolutely nothing to do with the campaign. And from a narrative standpoint, it really has nothing to do with the campaign. I mean, almost nothing. What was the point of the prologue? Now, from a design perspective, the prologue is there to get players up to speed with the history of Gears of War. Presumably, it's there to introduce a generation of new players who've never played Gears of War, into the Gears of War universe. But from a narrative perspective, it doesn't really do anything. It doesn't inform any of the narrative at all. Actually, none of the playable characters are in the prologue. And the way the prologue is given to the player, kind of there, and it's almost for a separate game. This might sound a little crazy, but I kind of want to pitch a prologue to you guys. This is what I would do. For one, it would take place, imagine you're playing in a squad of a couple years, and we're in the process of an ongoing conflict. JD and Dale, part of a squad, sent on a scouting mission to find these outsiders that have been raiding COG outposts. They are scolded for not wearing their helmets, which is COG issue. JD, Dell, and the other COG soldiers are tasked with tracking down the outsiders. And in this first mission, JD, Dell, and the COG come across locust beasts, or former locust beasts, such as corpsers, wild tickers. And I think it's important to establish the locust beasts as being feral, because that kind of has the theme of the locusts no longer being part of Sarah. The locusts are extinct. So showing wild tickers or some wild corpsers kind of on their own, doing their own thing, we see that the world returned to its natural roots, but it's still a dangerous world where the COG do want to keep order because there are still monsters that go bump in the night. And at this point in the game, the COG would have tracked down some of the outsiders back to maybe a camp, and at this point, there will be the game's first actual shootout against humans, the COG versus the outsiders. This leads to the COG, of course, killing some outsiders. At this point, we can then have JD and Dell get separated. We can have JD and Dell about to arrest or kill Oscar, and they're interrupted by Reyna and Kate. We establish the COG as a well-meaning yet oppressive government that forces people to obey or be crushed. The COG is a well-armed military going up against the outsiders, which are basically just scavengers, but the COG shows no mercy, killing them indiscriminately. So this could be a good motivation for JD and Dell to leave the COG. Maybe they see that Kate, Reyna, and Oscar are really just trying to go off and live on their own peacefully. After all, Oscar does have a backstory of being in the COG. Maybe JD and Dell, upon trying to arrest him, they realize why he left. And when they see he has a family, Kate and Reyna, it's just more character motivation for these characters that didn't get any motivation. A character like Oscar was presented in the game as a borderline stereotype. All he really needed was a sombrero. And from that moment, we already established the characters in the game, the main characters, Oscar, Reyna, JD, Del. And from that point, we can really just pick up where Gears of War 4 starts. 6 months later, with JD and Del joining Reyna, Kate, and Oscar as outsiders. And with this prologue, we basically establish the conflict of the outsiders and the COG have, right? We establish that they are two enemy factions that are in the middle of a war. We establish that the COG are, at this point, somewhat oppressive towards their citizens, and that some of their citizens have decided to abandon the COG government to go and live on their own. So this prologue does something that the current prologue and even the game doesn't do. It establishes the characters and their motivations and their relationships. I just find it kind of strange. If you were to watch the new Tomorrow trailer that came out ahead of Gears of War 4, I actually was a huge fan. I left a comment on that trailer. And if you haven't seen it, the trailer is amazing. It has JD running through a dark forest, wind is kicking up, he's being chased by an unknown enemy, and we have these flashbacks to Marcus and Anya, and Marcus is planting a tree. See JD running through the storm, the tree topples over, he jumps over it, taking cover, catching his breath, then suddenly this enemy jumps down and attacks him. He starts shooting his Lancer and the light flashes and we see JDF. And what's brilliant about this trailer is that when I saw it, I was very intrigued. I was like, wow, I wonder what this new enemy is going to be. And it's very emotional, right? It's like a symbolic passing of the torch. Marcus planting the tree that in the present time or in the future ends up saving his son. You know what I'm saying? It's like a very symbolic gesture. The tree, the father, protecting the son. But when we get to the actual meat and potatoes of Gears of War 4, there's nothing. A lot of people might disagree with me, but I really feel that Gears of War 4 just lacks the heart and soul of the other Gears games. And that's because we don't understand who the characters are. When it comes to Gears of War 1, we pretty much know who all the characters are. Baird is a smartass. Cole is the thrashball player turned soldier. Dom is Marcus' best friend, a sympathetic character you can relate with, looking for his wife. And of course, Marcus is the grizzled, hardened veteran from previous wars called back into action. All these characters stand out and are immediately identifiable through their personalities and their backstories. Who's Del? Yeah, that's the problem. I can't really tell you who Del is aside from JD's childhood friend. I can't tell you who Kate is aside from being an outsider who met up with JD and Del. And JD is just Marcus's son. JD, I like him, but then I said, why do I like him? And the only reason I could come up with is because he's Marcus's son. And that is the only thing I could think of. And when that is the only reason you can actually like a character, you know that character is very poorly developed. Kate and Del, kind of just there. And Marcus is good, feels kind of weak, that they had to include him in the game. And the other characters kind of make a cameo, but it's kind of embarrassing. Kind of like the cameos in Spy Kids, the Spy Kids movies. Like that's kind of a level of embarrassing cameo we have here. The music in Gears of War 4 is a little bit forgettable, and that might just be because I haven't played it as much as the other Gears of War games. And it's composed by Ramin Djawadi, who did a lot of the music, or I think he did all the music for Game of Thrones. In Game of Thrones, I do like the music there, but in Gears 4, it's just kind of forgettable. It's not really anything memorable. It's definitely no Locust theme from Gears of War 1. That has been in my head ever since I played Gears 1. But the music here is just kind of lackluster. And in terms of story, the wind flares are never explained. I always never liked the idea of the wind flares, and when I got into the game, I realized I really don't like them. They seem very gimmicky. I mean, to me it feels like they designed the drop shot and the buzzkill and said, you know, it'd be cool if we can like alter the path with wind. And then I feel like they designed the wind flares and kind of just ran with it. It's something that seems like it was designed for gameplay and not really for story. And that's something that is kind of a pet peeve of mine, and generally I don't like the wind flares at all. The wind flare sections to me are just kind of style over substance. The wind storms always felt like something to me that was more of a tech demo over anything else. It feels like this is something that they wanted to show off the power of the Unreal 4 engine. It feels very tech demo, like a very vertical slice part of the game to me, that this is something they wanted to impress people with, over entertain people with. The sections where you have to run through the windstorms kind of slow down the gameplay, and there's really nothing fun about being instantly killed by lightning. That's one of the biggest things I could say, is that much like a lot of the sections of the game that are made for these so-called water cooler moments, it's spectacle over fun. It's kind of trying to trick your brain into imagining it being fun because it's so over the top and so crazy. And that's actually one of the problems with the entirety of this game. It's style over substance. Like, what is this game? It's all sizzle. All these beautiful cutscenes, the artistry that goes into this game is mind-blowing. I always feel kind of bad for the designers and the artists in Gears of War, because most people pass off the game as just being a bro shooter. But when you really take the time to look at the cobblestones and the actual artwork that goes into these designs, it's really amazing. It's truly amazing. But a lot of that is just kind of wasted on a game that has a story that is 5 hours long, not really engaging, not really fun. One of the biggest plot holes I can think of is the Swarm themselves. It's established in the game that the Swarm, at least the Snatchers, they kidnap people, which are then turned into pods, which then turn into juvies, which then turn into the Swarm drones. Now, the Locust Horde was an entirely new race from the underground that came and attacked humanity. The problem with the Swarm is that they're created from humans. So that would mean that every Swarm drone you're battling against was a human. But how many humans have been kidnapped to make this army? Because it feels like not many, or at least potentially they can't have that many, right? I mean, I know they're kidnapping people from outsiders and COG outposts, but I also find it really hard to believe that a character like Jin, who has an entire COG army at her beck and call, doesn't seem to notice that monsters are breaking into COG outposts, presumably with armed guards, and thousands of people, presumably, don't notice this. And to be honest, one of the biggest things I didn't like about the Locusts are back is the idea that the Locusts died, but were really just kind of fossilized and came back. To me, that makes not a lot of sense, and I know you can argue that they're going to explain that in a later game. I actually would have been a lot happier if there was something where the Locusts, a small enclave of them, just survived and they had a Locust King. And that's another thing I wanted to point out, is that from the Swarm drones, the Juvies, are just almost completely alien to the Snatcher, Carrier, and Pouncer. When I first saw the first image of the Pouncer in the teaser trailer, I immediately thought it's going to be a completely new faction with completely new motivations. And then when I started playing the game, I started believing that, hey, maybe this is a new alien faction, a new completely different race that is trying to build an army. So they found maybe some Locust DNA and they kind of combine it with their own, and they're reconstructing humanity's greatest foe. That is what I thought. That is something that to me makes sense. But unfortunately, somehow Pouncers are related to Swarm drones, which come from humans. And yes, you can, if you really want to get into the lore of Gears, you can always argue that humans are somehow relatives to the Locusts. There's a little bit of lore in Gears of War 2 that goes into that, and obviously with Queen Mira appearing very human but still being Locust, there is some wiggle room there. But personally, I felt this to be just not very strong. I know Locusts are an iconic enemy, and I'm pretty sure the Coalition has learned their lesson from Gears of War Judgment. You know, in Gears Judgment, the multiplayer, you're fighting against people versus people, and that was absolutely hated by the fans. So you needed to have a Locust-like enemy in this game for the humans to fight against. So in the multiplayer, you have that iconic Gears of War Locust versus human combat. But this all just leads to something that is just not as good as the original, and just doesn't really blaze a trail. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that because the roots of Gears of War are so strong, it feels like the Coalition didn't want to break away and make something new. They didn't want to make a new alien race, and their explanation for how the Swarm are essentially just Locust 2.0 is not very satisfactory to me, and I find it to be one of the weaker elements of the story. And if you're one of the people that says, don't take the story so serious, or this is a type of game that you don't need to take the story serious, you're really doing yourself a huge disservice. You're saying that you, as a gamer, as a consumer, you don't need to have an entertaining story, that developers shouldn't try to make their games coherent or interesting. You'll eat it up as long as the graphics are good and as long as the gameplay is good. And I always find that to be so kind of self-destructive to the medium. It's like saying we don't care about having a good story. If you don't agree with me with much of my critique, that is fine. That is no problem. But if you're the kind of person who's going to say that my critique is invalid because I took the story too serious, or that I take games too serious, then you're, like, once again, you're doing yourself a disservice, and you're not doing anything to counter any of my points here. Let's end this review. There's a lot of problems I have with the overall campaign of the game, and I feel too many people just say, it's Gears of War, it's a bro shooter, and they don't hold it up to high standards. But I feel like this game just didn't fit the tone that the first trailer really tried to sell us on. I mean, when a game like Gears of War 4 has a running joke of killing a robot, it's just not funny, and that's kind of the tone of the game. And it failed to capture the tone of the original trailer, which really got me excited. And I know a lot of people were excited to play the campaign, but overall the campaign was just a dud. If you'd ask me what I think this game is truly missing, I think it honestly is missing Cliff Bleszinski. When Cliff envisioned Gears of War 1, he was really looking at stuff like Band of Brothers, the original Game Informer interview with Cliff about Gears of War. It really had a darker tone, and that's something that I feel they tried to do in this game, but they really horribly offset it with attempts at comedy, witticisms, character banter back and forth, and I honestly believe that Cliff leaving Gears is what kind of led to its downfall. I feel like if Cliff was in charge of Gears of War Judgment, they would not have had that horrible campaign that was really weak with the arcade mode kind of built into it, something I consider a huge design flaw in Gears of War Judgment. And I feel like Gears of War 4 would have had steak to the sizzle. And that's one thing I have to say about every AAA game, is that they go for the sizzle, they go for the beautiful cutscenes, they aim to make you forget that the game isn't good by the beautiful cutscenes, the amazing graphics, the huge budget, but they don't put any time into the actual stake. And the stake here is a story, and the story is just simply not good. And that's probably one of the worst parts about the story, is that all the most interesting elements of Gears of War 4's story is relegated to collectibles. They really have the foundation of what could be a truly interesting campaign, but instead just rely on the same old. And that's one thing I kind of wanted to conclude on, is that the prologue in the game is not a real prologue, and the game itself that we have is essentially a prologue to Gears of War 5. And what I mean is, it takes place in one day, there's no ongoing conflict, there is no war in Gears of War 4. This is the start of a conflict, this is the dawn of a new enemy. This is a prologue to Gears of War 5. This game is not a true Gears of War game in that sense. In Gears of War 1, 2, 3, and Judgment, there was actually a war. We joined the game mise-en-scene in Gears of War 1. So Gears of War 4 really fails on many fronts in terms of story, character, plot. I personally would say this game is a huge disappointment, and one of the most disappointing games I've played this year. Anyways, that's just my thoughts on the Gears of War 4 campaign. That's my thoughts and critique. Overall, I'll rate the campaign pretty unsatisfactory, and I can't really see myself going to play it again unless I'm playing co-op with friends. Well, thank you guys very much for listening, for watching. If you have any suggestions, you agree, disagree, go ahead and feel free to leave a comment. There's a lot of content I had to cut out of this audio here because I can honestly talk about game design for a very long time. And don't worry, I'm going to possibly talk more about, so stay tuned. I might make more videos on that. I might make a blog post. We'll see what happens. And if you want to hear another YouTuber talk about a game that has a huge budget and great visual effects, but very lackluster in story, then I would recommend checking out I Hate Everything's Destiny: The Rise of Iron video review. It's a great video. Honestly, if you're interested in game design and narrative design in games, just go ahead and check it out. And I want to say thank you for watching the video. Take care, and I'll talk to you later.